I was born quite a few years ago, 1929. I was born in East LA, Boyle Heights, which is east of Little Tokyo. And at that time, Little Tokyo was the hub of the Japanese community. And the Japanese community was primarily made of what they call truck farmers. There were immigrants who came over and they couldn't buy land, they couldn't get jobs traditional way, so they leased farm acreage, and they call them truck farms because they had just enough to harvest, and when they harvested, trucks would come out and pick up the crates. Little Tokyo was where the farmers would come to during the weekends to relax and go shopping and so forth. And my family had a store called Kawahara Company on 1st and Alameda, which was in the middle of Little Tokyo. My dad's business was to supply the farmers with material, and he was bilingual because he was born in Hawaii. My grandfather came from Hiroshima in 1897, and he left Hiroshima because of economic reasons. Wasn't making enough money, and he was a Yoshi, so he was adopted, and he felt an obligation to improve the family's life, so he came to Hawaii and supplied the plantation workers who had come from Japan. He started a general store, and he did very well. But he made a mistake of buying land in Hawaii and wanted to try growing oranges. And that's his entrepreneurship got a little bit too ahead of him. And then just before harvest time, the Mediterranean insects came in and infested the oranges, and he couldn't harvest them. So he had to file bankruptcy, and then he came to LA, and then he started this other business with my dad, which had to do with supplying the truck farmers. At that time, it almost wasn't a Nisei experience. It was a pure Japanese experience. I went to a Japanese language school, Chuo Gakuen, which was in Boyle Heights. And we would go to school, public school, finish, say, at 3 o'clock. A bus would come around and pick up Japanese students, and then we'd go to Chuo Gakuen. You had teachers from Japan. They're very strict. So it was not Japanese-American experience, it was more Japanese experience, that environment. And my grandfather, who came from Japan, in 1897, he said, you come into this house, you speak only Japanese. So we grew up almost like, and then Little Tokyo was all Japanese, and my dad's business was dealt with Japanese truck farmers. So the environment was almost all Japanese. After Pearl Harbor, then all changed. And we decided that we would pick up and move to Reedley. That would be Section 2, and we wouldn't have to go to camp. But in doing so, all of the inventory that we had at the store went down to nothing because competitors knew we had to leave, and they would just offer bottom price. It hit us financially, and then we moved to Reedley, and we stayed there from March through August, and they changed their mind, and they said, okay, you still have to leave. And then went into camp. I was freshman and sophomore. If we had stayed in LA, we'd have gone to Manzanar, probably first to Santa Anita, then to Manzanar, but we ended up in Arizona, Gila River, Arizona, which is an Indian reservation. The first day we got there, it was a big sandstorm. It was terrible. But actually, for those of us, freshmen and sophomore in high school, the experience in camp was not terrible. You didn't feel the barbed wire. And we didn't. Barbed wire was there, and the first several months there were some military guards, but later you didn't see them anymore. And so we just played baseball. I was class president in my sophomore year, so it kind of brought out my leadership desire. I'm not sure how I felt during my camp experience about, I didn't root for Japan to win. On the other hand, I didn't like it when they dropped the atomic bomb. You know, it was, I don't think they would have dropped the atomic bomb on Germany or Italy. It had to do with race. We also almost had this reaction, says, I'm loyal American. I am not Japanese. So some, like I have a cousin who didn't want to use chopsticks anymore. We also felt that people from Japan looked down on gaijin, people in the United States of Japanese descent. So we were not accepted by Japanese, and we were not accepted by America. So we were caught in between. So it was an empty feeling after Pearl Harbor. The few friends may have, they didn't want to be treated like traitors helping the enemy. See, that's why and we had such a small number. 120,000 is not very many, you know, spread over the western states. And so we were too small, too young. And it was panic because of the war. And I think that's where Japanese heritage helped. You help each other in the family, in the community, and you didn't protest. Shikata ga nai, you know, we just go along. You may ask why there wasn't any resistance to the camp internment. Well, the average age of Nisei who could speak English was under 19. So they were not mature enough. There were no political groups in support. It was way before the Civil Rights Movement. But you had the American Legion, Daughters of the American Revolution, other groups, right-wing groups, who thought it was okay. They should go, they're a threat. And there were two organizations, the B'nai B'rith, which is the conservative Jewish group, and the Quakers, who supported us. We were in camp for 2 years. We moved to Cleveland because they allowed us to move east of the 11 states. So we moved to Cleveland because my dad felt the high school in camp was of poor quality, and even if we graduated, we probably couldn't qualify to enter a respected college. So we went to Cleveland. But we learned something. The Midwest was more tolerant. Of course, they didn't know Asians, not like the West Coast, but they didn't treat us like the enemy. They just accepted us. They didn't know a little bit who we were, but they befriended us. I remember going to a bowling alley with one of them, and I didn't even hardly know him, but he was a high school classmate, and he showed me how to bowl. And I didn't have any money, and he realized I didn't, so he paid for me. And it was that kind of a change in environment from LA and Boyle Heights before the evacuation. The war was winding down, so we were allowed to come back to the West Coast, and we couldn't go back to LA because we had nothing. So we went back to Reedley, where our cousins were, and worked there. Went to community college for 2 years, then came down to UCLA. By that time, my dad, he had entrepreneurial instincts. We started an egg farm in Gardena, and that's how I learned how to sell. I go door to door and you get used to people slamming the door on you, and or complaining about eggs wasn't fresh, and so forth. But you overcome that resistance. But in looking back, the fact that we worked our way through it, and I was fortunate enough to have a nice career, and that was just a part of my life, and so I feel good about that, and I credit that to combination of being allowed to come to UCLA, and also my Japanese heritage to gamang and go through. I spent a year in Japan when I was in the Army in 1951 in Wakanai, and I really learned about Japanese people then, although it's a very small fishing village compared to Tokyo, which is much more formal and structured. They speak more correct Japanese than in a small village. And the Japanese ladies all liked American uniform, and so I learned how, a lot about women. Over here, everybody is very, at least Japanese Nisei community, very proper back then. My father wrote me and said, go visit our relative in Yuna. So I went down to Hiroshima to Yuna to visit. They're older people at that time, but they had a nephew or somebody about my age. So he showed me to go to a furo. There was a bathhouse. It's a small village. You don't have baths in every house, so you go to a bathhouse. So we went together. And I remember it was so hot. He go in, and after washing, then walk in. I couldn't go in. They're a distant cousin. The first time we met, and yet they treat me like, a brother. I think many of us feel we owe it to UCLA for our success. We couldn't just go to any school. Well, one, because they didn't accept Asians, or financially, we couldn't afford it. And I owe a lot to UCLA for my business success. When I started sales, you start off as a salesman in the brokerage business, and I got in the office with the 25 brokers, and I tried to be better than everybody else. It took me 12 years, but I became number one in the office. And then I decided, well, I want to go into management, compete at a different level. So I opened a Torrance office for E.F. Hutton. That's on Hawthorne Boulevard and Carson. And I was branch manager. And in 3 years, we ended up being third highest grossing office because I kept feeding them with different ideas. They asked me to become sales manager for the region. Then I became regional VP, and then I became a member of the board of directors. And then the chairman of the Pacific Stock Exchange wanted me to be president, so that's when I became president. I definitely feel that my Japanese heritage influenced my success in the business, because you work hard, you are always honest, you don't give up, you try to be number one, At least that's my interpretation of the Japanese culture. To me, there's a big difference between Japanese and Japanese American. The American culture, where you keep challenging, and therefore you are taught to think rather than just accept to protest, to challenge engineering. So I think that's the big difference between the Japanese American and Japanese. As I say, I am proud of my heritage, and I can relate to a lot of the Japanese culture, but I don't want to be exactly like the Japanese. I retired in 1989. My wife got seriously injured, and so she needed care, so I decided to retire from my business. And since I had time, I attended Alumni Association meeting, and Alan Charles saw me there, and he says, "Hey, I'd like to have you come into my office whenever you have time." So I went to see him, and he said he'd like to see more of a mixed population membership of the alumni. He wants to see more Asians. It was all white, back then. So I said, okay, well, I'll try. And we had a list of Japanese named alumni, and we asked them if they would like to join a focus group. So we formed 2 focus groups to find out how to attract Japanese alumni. So we formed the Nikkei Bruins. I wanted to make it a money-raising group. We said, okay, in order to join, you got to at least donate some money. And this is back in '91. I served on the Chancellor's Advisory Group, and I was picked because I was Asian, to make it a diverse group. And he talked about not having enough money to enlarge or create the area studies, which is different from ethnic studies.
That's right.
Area studies has to do with the old country, Japan, China. Ethnic has to do with more of the local Asian Americans. We formed this fundraising group, Nikkei Bruin. We needed a target to raise money for, and that's how we picked the area studies of Center for Japanese Studies. The Center for Japanese Studies was established in 1991, and that's when our group, Nikkei Bruin, got together. At that time, the need to learn about Japan was really great because there wasn't that much being offered at the school. There is a tendency for the Nisei to stay together, but now the next generation, they marry outside the Japanese, then I think things will change. My kids all married non-Japanese, and I have 7 grandchildren. I guess they just look at their own life, how things have been pretty smooth. So they may ask, or I may tell them, but they don't try to envision themselves having going through that, I think that's human nature. My motivation was try to make my wife happy and do as well as I can for my kids. They all went to nice schools back east. I helped them with buying their homes, things like that, and it's just satisfying to have other people appreciate what you do.